I thought we'd kick it off with Shawn. So when Shawn talks about his interventions, going into companies and trying to train people to become happier, I have to wonder, is this just a Shawn effect? Right? The formula is you bring in the world's fastest talking Southerner, add a little bit of positive emotion, and this is not something we can replicate. And then I also start to wonder, is this good for everybody? So do we want to make everyone happy? Some of you may be familiar with Julie Norham and Nancy Cantor's research on defensive pessimism. So as a quick word on this, typical optimists would go to a big, let's say, exam when they're in college and say, all right, about a week beforehand, I'm going to imagine the best possible scenario. I'm going to ace this exam. I'm going to go out and celebrate. And then you get really motivated and psyched up, and you study really hard, and you ace the exam. Many of us are defensive pessimists, though, which means a slightly different way of approaching this, which is about a week beforehand, you start to wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night. Oh my God, I'm going to fail. And then the next night, you're just up all night, and you're imagining what's going to happen if you get a 0 on this exam. And then the next night, you start to wonder, could I actually get a negative score? Can I lose points on my other homework? And you start to freak out. And that anxiety motivates you to prepare really hard and study. And the interesting thing is defensive pessimists perform just as well as optimists. So this anxiety actually serves as motivation. You harness it. It's what sort of drives you into high gear. And you study really hard. You ace the exam. But then next time, this time I'm really going to fail. Right? And the cycle continues. There is only one way, and I want to turn this over to Shawn now, empirically, to kill the performance of a defensive pessimist, which is to make them happy. If you look at the data, if you take a defensive pessimist and you induce positive emotion, they get complacent and their performance falls. What do we do about that?
I think the research is fascinating, but I think what you said at the very end is exactly the heart of it. You mentioned they become complacent and then they don't make any changes. And I think that there's a really big difference between the happiness we're talking about and complacency. In fact, I think that the movement that we come here to talk about, if we're trying to make people more positive and happier within our organizations, I think that revolution fails unless we actually redefine what happiness is. Most people that are against a lot of the happiness research assume that happiness seems to be pleasure, right? It's something that's momentary, but not related to growth at all. What I think we need to do is redefine happiness to be the joy. This is back from I went to the divinity school before this, so this is an ancient Greek definition. The joy that we feel growing towards our potential. I love that definition because it changes how we pursue it. The joy that we feel growing towards our potential, because joy you can feel in the ups and downs of life, even when things are not pleasurable, but it's directional. It's actually growth related. So it's not about stagnation with the present. It's about using the joy that we feel to actually motivate more change in the future to make a better external world for other people. But there's this research coming out that say that pessimists live longer than optimists do, and the pessimists can do just as well when they're worried about tests. But I think that they've misdefined optimists and pessimists. I was out here speaking in California, and one of the senior leaders from a CEO of a tech company who's not here offered to drive me to the airport afterwards to talk about how we could cascade this research out throughout his company. And I got into his really nice car. I was so excited about it. He got on the other side, started talking to me, and while he was talking to me, that bell was going off in his car, the seatbelt bell, and it finally just stopped going off. It got tired, and I turned to him. I was like, "You don't wear seatbelts?" And he said, "No, Shawn, I listened to your talk. I love your research. I'm an optimist." I was like, "No, you're an idiot." But I'd love to work with you. Optimism is Optimism's great for a lot of things, but it doesn't stop cars from hitting us. It doesn't stop reality from impinging us. It doesn't stop us from needing to actually be able to study for exams. Those studies that talk about pessimists that live longer, what they're doing, who they talk about as being pessimists are the ones that say to themselves, I might die, I might die someday, so I'm going to make sure that I watch my weight. I'm going to make sure that I exercise. I'm going to go check my cholesterol over and over again with the doctor because I don't want that to happen. That to me is not pessimism. That's the belief that your behavior matters, that you can actually change an outcome. Who they were talking about as optimists were the people that are like, I'm fine. I don't need to study. I don't need to go for cholesterol exams. I don't need to change my diet. Those are people who do not believe that their behavior matters. Those are actually, I would argue, the pessimists. What I would argue that optimism and pessimism should be, we should, and this is the final answer to it, is irrational optimism is the key out of this. I think a rational optimist is someone who doesn't start with rose-colored glasses, but who starts with as realistic assessment of, as possible of the present, but maintains the belief that our behavior matters if linked to the people around us. And I think if that's the case, I think that being a pessimist and optimist doesn't mean you don't see the problems. That's the biggest mistake. I think that both of them can see a big test looming, or death coming in the future, or sickness, or the problems we see going on within the world. I think what makes you an optimist and pessimist is what happens after you've seen the problem, right? After you see the problem, do you believe that it's permanent and pervasive? It affects everything. You can't change it. Your behavior doesn't matter. You're a pessimist. If you see this problem as one part of your reality, is local and it's temporary, that you believe that if you apply your behavior, this too will pass, you're an optimist.
So let's pick up on a thread there and turn this over to Paul in a second. So Shawn talks about the joy you feel growing to your potential. And I can't help but think of this research by Corey Keyes showing that when people make positive changes in their life gets worse. Because the serious part of adapting to changes means that even though the changes are desirable, you still have a lot of rethinking of your life to do. And so it's actually a lot of misery in growing. And the question is, Paul, how do you prevent that? So you're trying to create a lot of joy at Zingerman's, but you're also trying to stretch and challenge people and push them beyond their comfort zone. How do you make that happen so that they don't quit and they actually want to stay involved?
Wow. I think that what we try to do is, I don't really think that we're capable of motivating other people. I think that when somebody comes on to work on their first day, they're never more motivated than that. And then generally what we do is, kind of beat the joy out of them in most organizations. I think what we can do is we can help people identify their motives and encourage them to take action on those. And then how does that fit in? How do those personal goals that they have fit in with the organizational goals? So that, again, we have a very long-range vision. We talk about it all the time. We measure how we're doing towards it. And we ask everybody in the organization to write a personal goal, a personal vision each year on, rather than a performance review on what they want to accomplish in that year. I think that keeps people going. I mean, we do other things that I believe keeps people engaged in the organization that don't have anything to do with that. One is that we take enormous action in the public sector to contribute to the social and the educational and the cultural vitality of the community. So we donate back 10% of all profits every year into the nonprofit sector in the county. 5% of all profits go into a separate pool that's called the Community Chest, and that's an emergency relief fund for employees who are experiencing a financial crisis that's not of their own stupid doing. Like I bought too many flat screen TVs, can you help me out? No. My spouse has been unemployed for 18 months and we're going to lose our house. Can you help me out? Yeah, absolutely. So we do those kind of things also. Very few employees are going to access that. But the fact that we have that, when you talk about social connections and support group, because we have that available, that gets people feeling very, very good about their work. And we used to talk about, wanting that fun was one of our guiding principles. We do talk more about joy, because you can go through a shift and it's hard, and I wouldn't say it's a lot of fun, but on your way home you might experience the joy of having come together as a team, accomplishing something very, very difficult. We talk about having positive energy in the work, positive vibrational energy in the workplace. All of you, even at Google, I imagine, work with somebody who, when they come in the room, they don't have to do anything. They don't have to say anything. They don't have to look at you, and they immediately suck the energy out of the room. The energy vampires. We focus on, so we measure energy. We measure energy in our organization.
So to bridge this to Amy's work, I think one of the interesting threads that comes up here is the idea of actually thinking about employees' personal goals and trying to connect that to the organization's mission. Amy, job crafting is all about converting your personal goals into things that you want to do. Mm-hmm. But isn't that a symptom that a job has just been really poorly designed? So if people are constantly crafting their jobs in the wild, we're obviously doing a really bad job designing work that's a good fit for their skills and their interests. If we got job design right, does job crafting go away altogether?
I don't think it does, and I don't think it does for the following reason. So in thinking about job design and how very hard and smart work goes into creating and configuring jobs for individuals to keep them motivated, to keep them engaged, to keep them challenged, there are assumptions made about what it is that people are seeking from their work that have to be made to take that top-down approach to designing the work itself. And I think that one of the things that we've learned from understanding the relationship between people and the work they do is that regardless of what occupation you're talking about, the nature of the connection people have to that work, why it is they're there, what it is that they're seeking, varies greatly. It varies whether you're talking about people who are entry level at the bottom of an organization or people who are at the very top of their game. And so even a very well-designed job is a job that is mass customized in a sense, because it's a job that's the same for people across that category. So to that question, I would say I think job crafting this is why we see it everywhere, is inevitable. I think that being part of contexts where it is celebrated, where it is enabled, where it is supported by the organization and also watched, right? You don't want someone killing patients by accident or things like that, is probably a better route than trying to make a better and better and better and better job that will be a perfect fit for everyone.
Let's turn this over to the audience. Questions, comments? Tom.
I thought there was a theme that ran through all of your theories. I thought there was a really interesting theme that ran through all of your theories, and it's one I actually find in writing about foreign policy. And it's ownership. You use the word, I think everyone, one way or another, use that where ownership exists, where people have a sense of ownership of their job, their company, their future, good things follow. I would say the same is actually true in foreign policy. I wondered if you just each elaborate on that more. Is that as central as I think it is?
So I'll start. I think we know from, in thinking about the theme of ownership, in studies that go way back, even giving people a small amount of control or ownership over some aspect of their life, so this is true of nursing home patients and plants, and that they control this, ends up having a significant impact on their experience and their outcomes. I think if you're doing this in the realm of work, which back to Laszlo's point is so all-consuming of our time and of our focus and our energy, giving people some small measure to take control or to take ownership over some piece of it changes their experience of how they think about their own identity and the meaning of what it is that they're doing there in a way that just doesn't happen if you are the passive recipient of a list of things that you have to do and a set of punishments that will happen if you don't do them and possible positive outcomes that will happen if you do.
So we approach the ownership on a few different levels. One is when you start to work for us, everybody that works in the organization has the authority to do whatever they believe they need to do to make a customer happy. They never have to go to anybody else to ask if it's okay. That includes they can refund a $25,000 catering job. They don't do that. I mean, you worry about that. You worry about that. But they're actually less generous than the ownership is. So that's one. We've been on a trajectory toward more and more ownership and control over the history of the company, and from having open book and engaging everyone. I thought we were doing a really good job, but at some point I started to think that the work organization was like the last plantation, and that asking people to have open book but not have ownership was like inviting them over to the house, but then we all go sit down to have dinner and they still stay in the living room. And so we're now working toward actual ownership in the organization and control in the organization. There's 18 partners. We're all separate businesses. There's common ownership with my partner Ari and I, but we behave as one in the eyes of the IRS. We're one in the public's view. We're one brand, so things have to be pretty consistent. We meet every 2 weeks. We make decisions. All of them are made by consensus, and we now have added 3 frontline employees we call staff partners to that group, so that frontline employees are now making decisions at the community level. So we're always trying to deepen ownership and control in the organization.
Let me shift the question just slightly to what I focus on, which is happiness. But I think it's a really interesting one. It's who owns happiness? Because I I have a TED Talk that's on how happiness is a choice and leads can be an advantage. And I've got a report from an HR manager at a company whose boss, the CEO, sent that out to their entire organization and was thrilled about it. And I was thrilled to hear that until I found out that he was like, see, happiness is an individual choice. We don't need to be focusing on any policies here at the organization to do this, right? So if happiness is owned by the individual, then we don't have, our hands are off. Like if you're unhappy, that's your fault. It's probably your genes and your environment, or it's your choices you're actually making. I worked with a very large, we were talking about this earlier this morning, I worked with a large company that I won't mention, who they had me come in and speak to their senior level leadership, and they said, this works great here. Happiness in an organization, we need to have this, but we can't do this on our store floors, right? We could talk about this at senior level leadership, but we can't talk about this with people that are on the store floors because they don't make that much money, and I wonder whose fault that was, but like they don't make much money, but they also like didn't have a lot of education, or that they, some had family members in prison. You can't talk about happiness there. We went to those store floors, actually, to do some of the work that we were doing. And we found people that came up to us and said, you're a happiness researcher? You should study me. I'm the happiest person you'll ever meet. We found people that are incredibly joyful. And it's about what you were talking about. You've got people on both sides that think the other ones don't get it. I think that happiness is something that, yes, it's individual, but it's not necessarily about the external world. We can find it at every level of it. But while it's an individual choice, it's one that I think that we have a collective responsibility to influence. Just as you were talking about the vampires that can come in, we can negatively influence people. Why can't we positively influence people? I absolutely believe we can change people. We just have to show them models of creating greater levels of happiness. So I think happiness is owned by all of us.
We do have we have a couple simple things that we do that are very, very powerful. We have a lot of meetings in our organization. It's you need to have if you're empowering everybody. We're meeting dependent. We end every single meeting with appreciations. So it's Mormon style. If you want to say, it's like I really, really want to thank Shawn because my car didn't start this morning and he picked me up and drove me to work. To really, really big things. Meetings can start to run over. The employees will never, ever let us cut that part out. And when we have a company-wide meeting, it can go on for 90 minutes, and people crying.
So think about measuring happiness or positive vibe, and the frequency that you measure that. But I'm also thinking about tying it to the quantified self movement. So if I know my own happiness on a regular basis, or I know my own positive vibe on a regular basis, and how can you feed that back to the owner of the happiness or positive vibe? Have you seen that's helpful for people to understand that? And what's the level of frequency that is helpful for people to know my vibe or my happiness?
I don't know any studies on the frequency yet. Maybe you guys could fill in the gap. We don't know the frequency question, but we're really excited about it. Later this month, I'm going out to meet with Dr. Martin Seligman, who's the father of positive psychology from UPenn, and we're meeting with some of the MIT researchers. And if you're familiar with the X Prize, they've had X Prizes. We're working on an X Prize for happiness. And one of the very difficult challenges we're having is how do you measure it from the very beginning? So one of the things we're actually thinking about including within it is this idea of how do you create a feedback loop between what you're currently feeling and some sort of change you create. So for me, for example, one of the things that my wife, who's a happiness researcher, and I do is like sometimes when I'm feeling negative or stressed, she immediately says, you should do these, think of 3 things you're grateful for. And my brain has this like car wreck for a second, and then it can start to think about something else. I think you could do the same thing. We just have to be careful with it, because if you have like a little beeper, alarm that goes off on your phone every time your heart rate goes up, your heart rate's going to go up, right? But if we could find something that you could actually, in that moment, tell that person, yes, your heart rate's rising, or be able to do much more creative things now that we can do other things, that there's more sensors we're able to do. If we could link that to this happiness revolution that's occurring, I think what you get is the twin revolutions merge. Right? Because now you've got the technological revolution that's actually fueling our ability to create optimal human brain functioning. So I love that idea.
To add to that, I would sort of counter a bit on the other side to say that at the same time that I think there's great value to be had in feeding back to people what it is that's happening in their emotional state in real time, there's also, I think, great value in focusing people on the long-term sort of meaning and purpose of what it is that they're doing, so that even in periods where it's hard, it's a slog, it's a bad day, they haven't sort of made much progress, they don't feel particularly happy, the meaningfulness and the sense of purpose and contribution to an occupation, to an organization, to the world, to a long-term mission that they might have, is a counterweight to that. That I think, as you think about ways to measure this, one of the things that I think becomes interesting is what happens if that's perhaps complemented with a way of focusing people on the larger picture of what it is that might be sort of quite difficult. One of the things that we studied has been West Point cadets over a period of up to 14 years to see what is it that enables them to get through West Point, first of all, to thrive in the military and then to stay after they're done with their military service. And one of the things that ends up mattering a lot is their reason for being there, sort of the larger purpose that they are there because the end goals of the organization are the end goals that they themselves have internalized, as opposed to a shorter term kind of payoff. And so maybe combining these two things becomes...
Or maybe link the meaning, like if there's something meaningful about your job, like you have a picture of it that flashes up on a wearable device, right? Like if the reason I'm working is because I'm working for baby Leo, my kid, or if like it's for people that you care about that you've been donating your money to, if you could have some sense of being able to create meaning with that, I think that's where the key would be, is finding that meaning in those moments.
So in the spirit of thinking about making work better, I think probably the point to conclude on is we don't want to make this a daily question. Right? There is such a thing as measuring this too often. I think of Sonia Lyubomirsky's work on gratitude journaling, where she has people count their blessings every day and finds that it does no good. But if you do it once a week, you actually get this big spike in happiness. It's really hard for every day to have a lot of meaning and joy associated with it. But if you take a step back, there's a good chance that over the course of 7, something decent happens. And I think our goal as leaders, managers, architects of organizations is to try to increase the probability that when people sit down to do those kinds of exercises and reflect on the course of a week, that they can point to something really meaningful and motivating that occurred. Thank you all.
Thank you.